name is Leslie Picca, and I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Dayton.
Thank you. And we'll be talking about your book today, Two-Faced Racism, Whites in the Backstage and Frontstage.
Yes.
And you wrote this with Joe Fagan, right?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
All right. So if you could kind of give us an overview of what the book is and what you hope to accomplish with it.
Yeah. So the book is really intended to expand on some of the previous research that other race scholars have conducted that shows that depending upon how you ask the questions, you'll get different answers, particularly for white Americans. So there's research by Eduardo Bonilla Silva and Tyrone Foreman, who found that if you ask whites a question on a survey, you'll get different responses than if you ask them in an interview. And so what we wanted to do is really look at, okay, well, what happens when the researcher isn't there? So we asked over 1,000 college students across the US to keep basically racial diaries. So just kind of tell us, keep track in your daily lives. How does race impact your daily life? Does it show up in spaces where you weren't expecting it? Does it not show up in spaces that you were expecting it to? So that's really kind of the inspiration for this book.
Yeah, and in reading it, I was really struck by how universal the journal entries seem to be.
Yes. And we, so this project started at a Southeastern university, and we're very aware of the sort of Southern bias that we have about race and ethnicity, this sort of sense of, well, you expect it in the South, you may not expect it so much in, in other areas. So we really wanted to make sure that our sample size was pretty broad. So we had about 26 colleges and universities across the US. And yeah, in terms of geography, the only real difference that we saw was who the target was. So in examining the 626 journals written by white students, anti-Black racism was by far the most prevalent and fairly consistent. But we did see more, for example, anti-Asian comments in Washington State, areas in the West Coast, anti-Indigenous, Native American in some of the, mountainous regions that didn't show up so much in the Southeast and the Midwest. So, but really, other than that, that was kind of the real only kind of geographic difference that we saw.
Yeah, and maybe you can speak a little bit about what constituted a racial event and kind of how you contoured racism in the book.
Yeah, and so certainly, and that was kind of one of the things that we did for this project is we really asked the students, you let us know what kind of a racial event was. So, and I've done this in my own classes as well too, and have published articles using this as a teaching tool. And so really kind of keeping it open-ended in terms of asking the students, when does race show up? When does it not show up? I can share with you in my own classes with especially white students, many of them think initially they're not going to have anything to write about. And many of them will say things like, race doesn't impact my daily life. And, I'm just kind of doing what it is that I'm doing. And it's not until, we do offer some probes, think about who you're eating dinner with, who are you hanging out with, who's teaching your classes, who's cleaning up the garbage, who's serving as custodial workers. And many of the students said things like things were hiding in plain sight, that they really just sort of needed that little nudge just to pay attention to what was really taking place all around them.
Yeah, and I was interested because one of the points you make in the book is in the 1970s, blatant racism is replaced, and we have kind of what is now considered a colorblind or kind of an excuse or justification, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really one of the things that we look at in the book too, is how do we have conversations about race without ever mentioning race? And so in part of the chapters, we look at some of the racial code language that's used. So talking about good neighborhoods and bad neighborhoods. I hear this from my students all the time, where it sort of becomes a shorthand in terms of for racialized social spaces. So especially given how racial segregation is still the norm in our culture. And so we have lots of conversations about race without ever actually talking about race. And so some have suggested that, racialized hierarchies have just sort of gone underground. We now code it in different ways, whether or not it's related to social class or it's not quite as acceptable. Although some say, is this changing now? About being sort of overtly expressing an overtly racialized or racist perception.
Well, yeah, and that was one of the things that really came out to me too, is this idea that, white people don't often think about their own race. They're always constantly racializing others, but then they're also always in performance of white
Yes.
racial roles, right? And I think this idea of backstage and front stage talks to that directly. Could you maybe kind of tell us what that means and how?
Yeah, absolutely. And really, so front stage, backstage is, I mean, it's a fairly foundational theoretical perspective in sociology. So, dramaturgy. But this was really the first study to apply it to a racialized context. And so basically what front stage says is, it's kind of like all the world is a stage. We're all merely actors. You have your roles that you're playing. And so the front stage is where you're performing. And then in the backstage is where you can relax those expectations. You can prepare for future front stage interactions. I'll share with you that this project also came about from my experiences waiting tables, and I saw this very clearly. So I was a server at a well-known, establishment, and saw this among, my colleagues, where you'll go to the table and, hi, how you doing tonight? Get you started with a cold frosty beverage. Take a look at the menu. I'll be right back. And then you go in the backstage and you're grumbling and you're angry but then you come back out to the front stage and you're all happy again. And so that's fairly common for especially service work, but I noticed this in terms of racialized context. So, the servers being very polite, being very kind to especially patrons of color, but then in the backstage area, making subtle comments. I know I'm not going to get a good tip from that table. And so, using it in coded ways or kind of playing with race in different ways that they wouldn't do so much in the presence of folks of color. And that's really kind of the thesis of this book, is that what we found very clearly is that whites will oftentimes exhibit very different behavior when they are by themselves or when they think they're by themselves, as compared to when they are in or when they think that they're in the presence of folks of color. So using a colorblind perspective, it doesn't matter if you're black, white, purple, polka dotted, avoiding any mention of race or avoiding anything that could be perceived as being connected to race. So just this deep discomfort talking about race in mixed race settings. And it sort of makes sense. Truthfully, we don't have a lot of interactions with that. I think even today it can be very uncomfortable for folks, but that was different in the backstage. And I don't know if you want me to share a little bit about the backstage. So
Yeah.
one of the the biggest theme that we saw in terms of the backstage was this racial joking. And this was done almost exclusively in all white settings. There was a gendered component to this too. So it was disproportionately white males that would engage in this racial joking. Sometimes racial joking took place in front stage settings as a way of showing sort of how close a group is, but that was relatively rare. So it was more common in the backstage. And the power of racial joking is that it's really hard to diffuse, because oftentimes when somebody is challenged with it, the response is, it's just a joke. It's not meant to be taken seriously. And we're just having fun with it. And this is where even, comedians, there's many comedians who've made their, careers, joking about race, and there can be a fine line between, are you poking fun at the stereotypes to show just how absurd they are, how exaggerated they are, or are you replicating? Are you, reaffirming and reaffirming what these different stereotypes are? So that's really where some of the power of that racial joking comes in.
Yeah, and that was really important part of the book, and it kind of also lays out the different roles that white actors play in that backstage space, right? So you have the protagonist, assistants. So maybe you could kind of tell us what.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what was most surprising in these racial journals is I was sort of expecting for students to kind of tell on other people. And I was really surprised by how often whites told on themselves and said, I thought this or I did this. Um, but what we really found too is that it was a fairly small number of whites that would instigate this kind of racial joking. And it was much more common to have students say in their journals, I felt really uncomfortable, but I didn't know, I didn't want to spoil the fun. And I think that's really key, that this racial joking, this racialized, this perpetuating white supremacy is seen as fun. And so this sort of notion of, people oftentimes don't want to be like the wet blanket at the party, or, sociologists, we're not invited to a lot of parties because we're not a lot of fun, because we'll call things out. And so, people sometimes will say, I didn't want to be that person, so I was uncomfortable, so I rolled my eyes or just tried to change the topic. But so you have sort of different white actors in these backgrounds where you may have very few folks who are instigating it, but we also had very few whites who disrupted it actively. And so and there was a gendered component with that too. So we saw disproportionately it was white males who would instigate the racial jokes, white females who would try to resist, either kind of half-heartedly, or, oh, stop, you shouldn't say those things. And so then it becomes this sort of intersection between gender and race, and you start to see white males using racism as sort of a proxy for sexism, like, oh, you don't like it when I say the N-word, well, N-word this and N-word that. And so you can see there's kind of an interesting play between gender oppression, racialized oppression as well. So, but many of the students wrote about kind of the discomfort in their journals too, wanting to say something, making comments like, I needed to muster the courage to speak out. And because there certainly could be a cost in terms of challenging this, because the assumption is you're not going to challenge it. And I think the other thing too that was really surprising was that it wasn't just among family and friends, but white strangers too. So we saw this backstage among white strangers, employers as well. And so this is where we can really see sort of just how do these different racialized stereotypes perpetuate themselves. Where's the power in this? If you're talking to a police officer, if you're talking to a professor, if you're talking to your employer, that's a really big kind of status differential to speak out and to challenge against that. And so those were some of the settings that we actually saw these kinds of comments taking place.
Well, it kind of throws the modern or the more recent connotation of safe space into a new meaning, right? So it's where these racial performances happen, and the racial person who's being racist is seen as safe. One of the other things I thought interesting in that, kind of along with that, is there were a lot of excuses where he's a good guy.
Yes.
He just made that joke, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. We certainly saw that a lot in terms of, he isn't racist, he's a nice guy. We're just having fun, and so there was this sort of sense of, we have this image of a racist as being the, sort of, Klan member, or the neo-Nazi skinhead, somebody who's burning crosses. And, these are just college kids. These are the best and the brightest too. I mean, these are, some of our, nation's top leaders, future leaders, who are just sort of having fun with this. And so, so it really does sort of challenge that notion of racism. I'm a sociologist. And so I look sort of less at the individual in terms of how is this reproducing these structures that we see in place, and how do we see, and the other thing is some of the students would make comments like, well, grandpa is racist, but he's a product of his time. Racism will end when grandpa dies. I mean, they would actually write things like that. And so, but what we saw is that no, grandpa's racism is still sort of alive and well. It's, it's being kind of reproduced in these small kind of group dynamic kind of ways that, perpetuate these racialized hierarchies that we still see today in 2022.
Well, and that's part of it going underground, right? Too. So when the safe space was the public square, and now it has to go underground, and it kind of diffuses through this humor, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so, so there's been a lot of commentary about sort of safe spaces who is it safe for? So who is it that it's, that it's not necessarily safe for? And we also tend to do a lot to ensure white comfort. And so you can see that right now in terms of, political, bills that are, coming forward. And so the sort of notion that even when folks were challenged about their kind of backstage, conversations, there was sort of the sense of like, hey, why are you, kind of bringing this down? And, we're just having a good time. And, this isn't harming anybody as long as we're not caught. And so the context was really key in terms of there's a right context and spaces for saying it and a wrong context too. And so we spent some time looking at that sort of fluid boundary between what happens when somebody comes out where somebody thinks that they're white, but it turns out they're not completely white. So whether or not they have folks of color in their family, whether or not they are, multiracial. And so there's this sort of sense of, I didn't mean to say it in that context, or, apologizing when you're caught, but not necessarily when you're not.
And that seemed like a overriding fear that kind of disrupted this backspace and kind of puts on a new modern twist on the term passing, right?
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. So yeah, and I think really, I mean, it really illustrates too just how, and we asked the students as well to self-identify, what their race is, and they kept the journals themselves. And so so this sort of sense of, I think we think of race as being in these kind of, clean cut categories and boxes that we're used to filling out on, in the US Census or college applications, different spaces. And so it's much more fluid, and even people sort of playing with race too. And so, coming out and saying, why would you say that I'm not white, even if they really are white? And so this sort of sense of kind of, playing around with it and not seeing it as something that is kind of essential to who they are. But, sociologists would talk about, how race is socially constructed.
And if we move from the backspace to the front stage, I was really interested in kind of how this area privileges white people as well.
Yeah. So in the front stage, I mean, so that's really in kind of mixed race interactions, and certainly there were some instances where people had comfortable kind of interactions and engagement, but certainly we saw a lot of avoidance, whites being careful about what they say, how they say it, who they, are speaking in front of. So I recall one student who was talking about, he didn't want to say we could go to, a Mexican restaurant to his roommate of color because he didn't know if saying a Mexican restaurant, is that racist to say? And so I think there's a lot of discomfort. There's white fear, I think, in being called out as being a racist. And so again, I think, one thing that we really see is that we still tend to think of race and racism is individually determined based on a person's individual motivations. And so thinking like, and even now you'll hear about these things like, I don't know what's in his heart or her heart, I can't respond to that. And so, kind of getting beyond that and saying it isn't so much just, between individual interactions, but how does this relate to broader social structures? How does this relate to segregated social spaces in which some of the students said, I don't have a lot of interaction in the front stage because I'm mostly interacting with largely white folks. And so so it certainly says a lot about who it is that folks are interacting with as well.
Well, and that kind of brings me to the last final piece of this, for me at least, was the idea that like we have racialized all these other minorities into stereotypes and kind of negative connotations, and the most negative thing you can say about a white person is that they're racist. And so the front stage is just this constant like, I have to signal tolerance. I have to signal that I'm not a racist.
Yes.
And that becomes itself a form of white supremacy, correct?
Yeah, and it certainly is this sort of performance too. So sometimes, students talking about, I deliberately sat next to a person of color on the bus because I didn't want them to think that I was a racist person because I'm white. And so there is this sort of sense of almost performativity that's related to it. I don't know, I can just share too. So we've started doing more data gathering for the journals written by the students of color. So And I've done some publishing on just making those comparisons between the journals written by white students and the journals written by students of color. And they are remarkably different, very different. And I think there's some sense that, from what I heard after the book came out, where people said, yes, whites talk badly about folks of color, but they do it too. So folks of color are talking badly about whites in the backstage. And what we found is that there's some of that taking place, but it's not as vicious, it's not as damaging, and it's not as frequent. And so in part because folks of color don't have the institutional resources to commit broad discrimination against whites in the same way that we see white students, do have that kind of institutional power to enact discrimination. And the other thing that we found is that the comments against students of color or folks of color by whites was largely relying on stereotypes. And so not necessarily relying on personal interactions. We found that the journals written by students of color, the anti-white comments tend to be based on a specific interaction. So one African-American woman talked about, she was using the restroom and she saw a white woman use the restroom and leave without washing her hands. And she made a comment to her friends about white people are so dirty, and that's not a nice thing to say about a whole group, but that's different if it's based on a specific interaction as compared if it's something that's not based on interactions, but that's based on generic stereotypes. So we certainly are seeing some very clear differences in terms of those journals.
It's interesting, and that kind of makes sense because there's this, when we were talking about joking, that is based on, no one comes up with a racial joke. These are passed down based on these institutional. So when you were talking about being a sociologist, could you kind of maybe talk to us about the macro level a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And even, in my classes too, we spend a lot of time looking at racialized stereotypes and seeing where do they come from. So where are these stereotypes coming from in terms of some of the more prevalent stereotypes that showed up in the journals were things related, for example, to African-American criminality or laziness. We can actually track that and see those were ideologies that were created during the days of enslavement to justify a system of enslavement. And so these are centuries old stereotypes that we're relying upon. And so so many of the stereotypes that we see, if it's related to AAPI, Asian American kind of model minority, you can track that to the 1960s as a way of kind of pitting racial groups against each other. So, so there's deep infrastructures in place that you can actually track it kind of historically and see where is this necessarily coming from. And we just don't have that same, we are a culture in which if you look at it from, who has access to resources, the wealth gap, housing disparities, educational gaps, other forms of, home ownership. Very clearly we see, whites have greater access to resources as compared to, to folks of color, especially BIPOC individuals, African-American individuals, and Indigenous and certainly Latinx individuals. And so this isn't something that's individualized, but we see it in terms of, the connection to the broader culture.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And I think we could kind of end with, what would you suggest we do as white people to not perform so much in both spaces?
Yeah, I think some of it just has to do with kind of, getting outside of your comfort zone. We certainly know in terms of reliance on stereotypes that the more people of that group, the greater interactions that you have that are egalitarian, that are goal-oriented, that are, sustaining, that, it's harder to rely upon those stereotypes. And so much of it really has to do with also holding other whites accountable. And so certainly there's that sense that, I know I am listened to differently than some of my colleagues of color. And so it really is, the others have said, racism is really a white problem, and it's going to take white folks stepping up to the plate if we actually want to, enact some kind of change. So not waiting for a person of color to show up and to, disrupt, different racialized kinds of comments, but it really requires white accountability. And I'll just share, there's a fantastic book, and I don't know her. Heather McGhee has The Sum of Us. It's this book that, talks about how racism harms everybody, seeing this is everybody's issue and challenge. This isn't just something that's, only impacting, marginalized and minoritized, individuals, but we all have a stake in this in terms of a shared humanity and shared future. And especially for young folks, recognizing, the US is demographically changing, racially, ethnically, much more globally interconnected. And so we all have a stake in terms of, having a more equitable and, diverse workplace and school and social settings, things like that.